Nick talked enthusiastically about public goods and what they do to the efficiency of the market, namely destroy it. I'm going to briefly recap this. From a legal perspective, property rights come in three parts: the right to use, the right to exclude, and the right to destroy. And only if you have the right to destroy, you have a complete property right. But property rights are often attenuated. I have the right to use my car, but I do not have the right to use my car when drunk, right? That's an attenuation of my right to use. I have the right to exclude you from my car, to throw you out, but I can't do that while driving. So another attenuation of my property rights. And I have the right to destroy my car. I can let it go to rust and let it crumble, but I cannot blow it up because that would endanger bystanders, right? So even though it is my car, there's things with my car that I cannot do. From an economic perspective, we often look at goods through the lenses of excludability and rivalry. So a purely private good is both excludable and rival. And here we have the example of an ice cream. It's my ice cream, so you can't eat it. That would be stealing, right? So it's excludable. But it's also rivalrous. If I eat the ice cream, you can't because it's gone. There's also goods that are not excludable but are rivalrous. Those are open access resources or commons good after the commons. And it used to be that every village had a commons, and everybody who lived in the village had the right to graze their sheep and goats on the commons. So nobody could be excluded. At the same time, if my sheep has eaten the grass, your sheep can't eat the grass because it's gone. There's also goods that are excludable but not rivalrous, and one example is a concert. If you want to see this band, and I can't see who it is, if you want to see this band, you have to buy a ticket, so it is excludable. But your enjoyment of the music does not affect my enjoyment of the music. We both can consume that music without affecting each other's consumption. So it's non-rivalrous in consumption. And then there are pure public goods that are both non-excludable and non-rivalrous. The ocean is an example, the atmosphere is another example. The problem with public goods is that they're underprovided because the provider is not sufficiently rewarded. That comes from the inability to exclude, and overconsumed because the consumer is not sufficiently deterred, and that comes from the non-rivalry, and that implies that there has to be some sort of public intervention to increase the provision of these particular goods and reduce their consumption. Paul Samuelson showed that the condition for product mix efficiency is that the marginal rate of substitution equals the marginal rate of transformation. Samuelson did not show that, but that is true for a private good. Samuelson showed that for a public good, what you need is that the marginal rate of transformation equals not the marginal rate of substitution, but the sum of the marginal rates of substitution. And that instead of a vertical aggregation of demand functions, as is the case in private goods, what we need is a horizontal aggregation of demand functions. Let me make that a little bit clearer. So we have two people in this economy, Anna and Brewster, and in the top figure here, top left, you're looking at their demand functions. So the higher the price, the lower the demand, and the lower the price, the higher the demand. But Brewster is a bit more enthusiastic about this. Good at lower quantities and less at larger quantities. Then is Anna. Now, if these were private goods, then what you need for the total demand is vertically aggregate the two. So at price 4.5, Anna is not interested, she doesn't want to buy anything, but Brewster is, so the aggregate demand function is really the same as Brewster's demand function. And then slightly below 2.5, Anna starts demanding things as well, and total demand is the vertical sum of this curve, and that makes this curve here with the kink at Anna's choke price. Now, if this is a public good, you need to horizontally aggregate the demand function. So let's see what happens. If quantity is 0, Anna is willing to pay almost 2.5 to increase this to slightly more than 0. Brewster is willing to pay almost 5. So in total, they're willing to pay almost 7.5 to get there, right? If the quantity supplied is 5, then Anna is prepared to pay slightly less than 2 to get more, and Brewster is prepared to pay slightly more than 3. So the total at 5, total demand at 5 is around 5, right? So what you need to do is add the curve, the demand curve of Anna to Brewster's demand curve as follows. Not vertically, but horizontally. And the kink is where Brewster's demand goes to 0, not where Anna's demand goes to 0. And the demand curve looks like this. In this particular graph, both demand curves are drawn. This is the vertical aggregation of the demand for the rival good, and this is the horizontal aggregation for the demand for the non-rival good. And you see that the two functions are different. For the same supply curve, you would end up in a different equilibrium Qn rather than Qr, where R is for rivalry in consumption, and N stands for non-rivalry. Eric Lindahl took the Samuelson condition a little bit further, and he argued that, well, if the marginal rate of transformation should equal the sum of the marginal rate of substitutions, then really, in order to get an equilibrium, what you need is that every individual pays a personalized price. And that would be equal to their willingness to pay for the public good. So rather than charging the same entrance fee to everybody for, say, a natural park, you would charge everybody a different price to get in. Now, that is true in theory. Of course, in practice, it is exceedingly hard that someone sits at a gate or something and says, you look different than the other person and therefore you should pay more, or I think you're willing to pay more, or you're willing to pay more and therefore you should be paying more. That is just not a very practical way of pricing anything.